Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm Terry Robinson, your moderator for today's webcast, Data Protection in an Increasingly Complex Cloud Environment, brought to you by GCN and sponsored by Rubric. Um, so, state and local government IT operations have found a new resiliency after they shifted to the cloud, making essential systems location agnostic and enabling far more affordable continuity of operations planning. This has been especially important as both employees and citizens increasingly engage with government systems from remote locations. But cloud comes with risks of its own, and data and protection in particular can vary. So, to ensure real resiliency, government agencies have to choose and configure their services very carefully and craft a cross service strategy that prioritizes both protection and recovery. Our speaker today is Troy Case Schneider. He's GovExec's General Manager for Government Technology Brands, and for many years has been the editor-in-chief of both FCW and GCN, which are two of the oldest and most influential publications in the public sector IT. I'm delighted to welcome him here, but before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items to go over. If you'd like to enlarge the slides, look for the square icon at the top right corner of the slide window. You can also view the presentation in full screen mode by clicking the squared arrows icon. If you would like to submit a question at any time, you'll find a question field to the left of the slide window where you can type in your question, then hit submit. We'll address those questions at the end of the presentation. If you have any technical difficulties during the session, click the yellow question mark icon below the slide window for technical assistance. We're going to send you a link to the archived version of the session so you can view it again or share it with a colleague. And the on-demand version of the webcast is going to be available for 90 days after today. And now I'd like to welcome Troy. Hey, Troy, let's get started.
Thank you, Terry. I appreciate that. I'm very happy to be here today. So as Terry said, we're going to talk about data protection in the cloud environment, some of the risks that are out there and how organizations are trying to manage that complexity and make sure that they have the necessary resiliency. While I'm listed as the speaker, I'm really sort of a facilitator and curator for insights from several different government officials that we're going to turn to today, who've spoken with us at previous events or in other contexts, and have them share a little bit of their story about either what their agencies are doing or the resources that are there. So we'll talk about some of those common risks to manage. We'll talk about resources that are available primarily from the federal level, but available to governments to all levels of government. And then we're going to look at what a few different agencies are doing with their own cloud migration, modernization, and security plans. Before we get to that, though, I want to just take one state and local example, which is what the city of Pittsburgh is doing right now, and it just sort of reiterates why organizations are looking to move to the cloud. City of Pittsburgh is a little less than a year into a 4-year migration plan that's focused on creating and scaling their citizens-facing services. It spans 19 departments, and they've done a good job, I think, of articulating their reasons for making this push. Scalability of services, improving infrastructure security, which will really be the focus of today's event, and then enhanced data services by getting the data in one place to where it can start to break down the silos of different data sets and use it in different and more effective ways. But when you're talking about this many different government services, this many parts of an organization, it gets complicated quickly. And we want to talk a little bit about where cloud projects go wrong. And we're going to talk about 4 different flavors of failure. And this is all drawn from a McKinsey study of cloud migration efforts, not just from the public sector, but organizations of all stripes. I'm not going to read these. The slides will be available for you to review afterwards if you want to get to this, and we'll have links to some of the source material. But pilots stall, where it's just hard to get from the proof of concept to large-scale operations. Cloud gridlock, and just where the complexity starts to bog down the efforts to do the monitoring, do the automation processes, and just not having the proper architecture in place. Organizations trying to avoid that complexity by simply lifting and shifting, which may avoid some of those new challenges, but also brings very few of the benefits that organizations are hoping to get from cloud. And then cloud chaos, which is really, because it is so easy to move things into new services or to spin up new instances under a cloud services agreement, sort of shadow IT at the enterprise scale becomes an issue for organizations. So we're going to, I think, really focus on the last two, or cloud gridlock and cloud chaos here. So 2 and 4 of the list, but all of them are real risks to manage. And then I wanted to sort of pull, what the goals of what we're trying to make sure that we can enable for organizations, and go to a list that Ann Duncan put forth a few months back. Ms. Duncan is now the CIO at the Department of Energy. She has held the CIO role in local government in Santa Clara, California. She did a previous stint in the federal government at EPA. She's also worked in the private sector, so brings a really good range of expertise and sort of understanding the challenges in different types of government organizations. But in trying to have that resiliency, it's enable rapid recovery, and destructive events could be acts of God or just bad actors, the ransomware attacks and the other cyber attacks that all organizations face. Want to make sure to optimize the data protection for future use, trying to avoid that cloud chaos and ensure that stakeholders are in unison. And then, especially important over the last 2 years, equipping employees with the tools for remote work. And so those are the goals. How to get there in a cloud environment is really a complicated effort. And so I want to start with our first government speaker with hearing from Jennifer Franks. Ms. Franks is with the Government Accountability Office, which is the oversight organization, an arm of Congress to look at how federal agencies are operating. And Ms. Franks heads the Information Technology and Security Division. And so she and her team spend a tremendous amount of time looking at federal agencies, IT modernization projects, security posture, and there's a wealth of resources that GAO puts out. Their audits and reports, while focused on the individual organization usually, have all sorts of best practices. So if we can, we're going to go to a short video clip of Ms. Franks talking about some of the findings that she's seen in those recent studies.
I want to look at best practices for implementing Fedramp in support of cloud migration efforts. And GAO was asked to review Fedramp. And of course, GSA manages Fedramp, which then provides a standardized approach to ensure that cloud services meet security requirements. For our review, we conducted a survey of 24 agencies and then 47 cloud service providers to just understand how all of these entities use Fedramp to authorize cloud services for their environments. And we then also selected 4 agencies to do a little deeper assessment and deeper evaluation on how those agencies were assessing policies, their plans, their procedures, and even looking through their authorization packages for cloud services. And I'm noting all of these agencies because it's really important to note, at least for this part, we heard from a larger audience, not just federal agencies or service providers on a limited scale. And our efforts really did highlight that although OMB required agencies to use the program, it just did not effectively monitor agencies' compliance with the requirements of Fedramp. This means, of course, OMB may have less assurance that cloud services used by the federal agencies even meet federal security requirements, which is obviously a problem. Also, Fedramp's continuous monitoring progress does not allow for the automated review of control requirements by agencies with security management tools. And of course, we made recommendations to improve this process with GSA. So in addition to this, it's really hard for agencies to discuss cloud migration efforts without discussing costs. Even at GAO, it's all about costs and is there a savings? And is there a means to an end? And is this a worthwhile process for our agency? And that's the discussion all of us are having. So the cost of using Fedramp or even cloud computing was not really in the scope of our Fedramp engagement. However, in working with the agencies and discussing this with them, we noticed that there was consistent definition or application, no consistent rather definition or application of what Fedramp costs and how those costs look from each agency's perspective. Several agencies managed it differently. Some track the costs, and apply their IT staff and support. Some do not. Some just don't track costs at all. So it was really challenging to compare what these costs should look like, what they could look like, and how they would benefit services at these various agencies when they're using Fedramp related processes and procedures. So then what would help? Well, agencies believe that a standardized definition of how to calculate the cost of Fedramp and possibly savings component to that would then create some baseline efforts, a foundational baseline across the agencies, which would allow us to track the program performance, whether it's delivering the expected value or if not. We did also have a job in 2019 that did look at cloud security costs. And in this review, 16 agencies were making progress in implementing computing requirements by establishing assessment guidance, performing those assessments and testing, and then implementing cloud-based services. But they were all varied in their progression efforts. We did make some recommendations in this report for OMB to definitely consider, explicitly making some refinements on how government agencies should apply costs, evaluate costs for moving their services into the cloud and using the Fedramp services, at least on a quarterly basis. The savings and costs should be identified with the investments that the agencies are making. And we did make a recommendation, and to date, from 2019 to now, it does unfortunately remain open. So lastly, while I've noted several things that could help to strengthen Fedramp implementation, there really is quite a bit of guidance out there, federal guidance and industry standards that would help all of us to accelerate our activities for cloud migration efforts. And there's so much guidance, there's so much data from security measures to procurement, to even workforce related issues, which all of us have talent acquisition issues and concerns as well in this IT and cybersecurity environment. And the guidance even looks at implementing identity, credential, and access management, for example. And this is an essential part of continuous data protection efforts and awareness in cloud-based environments. And our wonderful speaker before us, well, before me rather, he discussed zero trust a little bit more than I have in this presentation. But as you all know, zero trust is significantly outlined again in that cybersecurity executive order. And this ICAM can be directly aligned with zero trust. Other guidance also looks at transitioning our systems to a multi-layer defense strategy. Agencies could take a risk-based approach to securing cloud environments by placing an emphasis on protections at the data layer in addition to the network and physical infrastructure layers. And there's even guidance about establishing and implementing incident response and mitigation capabilities for security controls to help protect our security and privacy incidents that are managed by the cloud.
So covering a lot of different issues in short order there, but I just want to go back to one thing that Ms. Franks mentioned, which is the the role of ICAM and a little bit of zero trust. That is something we'll come back to with one of our later speakers. But I want to move to the some of the specific resources that are available, and the importance of really starting with the security structure, making sure the risk management framework is there for these systems. And NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, offers a tremendous amount of standards and guidance for organizations to start to try and bring some structure to these complex systems and know where the risks really are. And I'm going to hear from Ron Ross, who has been sort of the godfather of risk management within the federal government. But NIST's mission is to provide these resources to all organizations. And he's fond of saying that the adversary lives in the cracks. And what NIST is trying to do with these resources is help identify and patch over said cracks. So if we can go to Mr. Ross here.
Well, the ecosystem is a term that I like to use to describe all the moving parts that you have to worry about. And if you look at the recent SolarWinds breach, the sunburst, and all the things we've been reading about in the news, this really illustrates, again, the point I made about complexity in the adversaries. The adversaries will work in any part of your system to include your supply chain. And they don't really care where they get in or how they get in. They just need to get in and figure out a way to complete that attack chain they have to go through. And so the ecosystem today includes all of those system components, all those systems that you interact with, all the supply chain, the contractors. And what this really means is that it's the weakest link. We have kind of a shared risk today. And wherever that adversary gets in, whether it's a contractor or whether it's into your system specifically, or even a cloud provider, that risk then goes out to everybody. And we can all be affected, as we saw in a massive way. The attacks now are not just localized, but they are going from local to, they're scaling up to hundreds and thousands of customers who may be interacting with that contractor, with that provider of software, and the things that happened during SolarWinds. So let's go to the next slide. So some of the things that we're doing at NIST to help the situation, we updated just a few months ago our flagship security and privacy control catalog. I'm sure most of you out there have heard of NIST 853. It's got a lot of controls in there, and we did a lot of work, and it took us almost 3 years to get this update completed. And by the way, everything I'm talking about today on the NIST pub side, we're working very closely with our Fedramp partners, and everything that we publish, they will end up integrating into the Fedramp program, and you'll be seeing that. They've already started that with revision 5. But just to give you a sample of some of the things that we added to the catalog, we have a full integration of privacy controls. Privacy now stands shoulder to shoulder with security, equally important. And with that new focus on privacy, to include our new privacy framework that we published last year, that really was a top priority for us in the update of the NIST 853. We have one new family of privacy controls. We collapsed the previous 8 families that were in an appendix, and we now have the privacy family as one of the main members of our 20 control families. We also integrated privacy into other security controls where we could take advantage of a dual use control. For example, the education, training, and awareness control. That control now does double duty. It helps for security training as well as privacy training and awareness. So we're making the catalog more efficient. We're expanding the reach with privacy. We also added a very important new family on supply chain risk management. That's going to be a really important topic going into 2021. We buy products, systems, and services from around the world. It's important that we know the pedigree, the provenance of where those products are coming from, how they're being developed. And it's all about managing risk. What kind of trust can we put in all of these things we're bringing into our critical systems? That applies to cloud computing providers as well as the folks doing their processing on premise, because at the end of the day, cloud computing is really using the same computing technology. It's computers, it's servers, it's applications all working together to bring a capability. We also added some security engineering controls, and this is going to allow our federal customers in their contracts to talk about what kinds of security design principles and concepts do they want to see in the products and systems and services that are being brought back into their environment. These would also be applicable to our cloud service providers who are building systems. Those cloud systems have to be built with the same discipline and structure that any system would be built to. And of course, we're always adding new controls to deal with some of the new threats that we're seeing. We collaborate with our partners in the Defense Department and the intelligence community to understand who are the threat actors, where are those threats coming from, and do we have a sufficient number of safeguards in our control catalog to be able to have our customers defend their system.
So I just want to foot stomp a couple things that Mr. Ross mentioned about the importance of those inherited controls. This is about understanding where those cracks live and making sure that you're not assuming that one party is handling the security when they're really not. And also just for the division of labor here, and that that automation and APIs are key on this to be able to pass that information through. I also wanted to take this moment to give a shout out to Fedramp, which was mentioned earlier in the presentation. And Fedramp is a federal program to sort of share the risk assessments and authorization process, the authorities to operate that are needed for all federal systems, so that not every agency has to continue to jump through the exact same hoops with a cloud service provider that's been vetted and used by many other organizations. It is officially a program only for federal organizations, but it has also come to serve as sort of a good housekeeping seal of approval for the security of cloud service providers, and something that many state and local organizations look to. There is also a new organization called Fedramp that launched a little over a year ago that is aiming to bring that same structure to the state and local governments, where people can reuse those risk assessments and authorizations. And we'll share the links to both of those organizations later in this presentation. So I want to go back to Mr. Ross for just a moment to talk about how this work translates into greater resiliency.
I mentioned earlier about the complexity issue. One of the things that's going to be a continuing problem for both cloud providers and all the other folks who are managing systems is this notion of how we defend our systems against the advanced persistent threat. These are adversaries that are really, really good. They're well-resourced. They have a lot of smart people, and they understand our systems better than we do. So for the last 40 years, our strategy has been one-dimensional. Penetration resistance is really what we try to do. We try to stop the adversary at the front door if we can. But we know that doesn't always work. We saw that just last month with the SolarWinds attack. And so really we need a multi-dimensional strategy. Defense in depth, it's been called. That second dimension I talk about here on the slide is being able to limit the damage the adversary can do once they're inside your system. They're going to get in at some point, especially if you have a high value or a critical program, because they are targeting those particular systems. So limiting the damage really gives us more of a defense in depth approach. And what that means is you limit the damage. I think some of the previous speakers talked about limiting damage through zero trust architectures. You make it very difficult for the adversary to move laterally. They get in, but they just can't move. It's kind of like having that lock on the front door of your house. You know, the bad guys get in through the lock on the front door, and then every room in your house has a vault, and they've got to go through that very detailed structure getting into every vault, and it slows them down and increases their work factor. We can also limit the damage by the time they have on target. There's a lot of work going on now with virtualization, micro-virtualization, where you churn the infrastructure of the system more quickly than the adversary can take advantage of the attack chain they have to go through. So you limit their time on target so dramatically that they can't get through that attack chain. So those two ways of limiting damage, the technology is already here. We just have to make sure that we implement it and we take advantage of that to really give us more of a defense in depth view. Ultimately, we're looking for system resiliency, where that system can operate even while it's under attack. We have to be able to continue our critical and our essential missions and business operations, even if it's in a degraded or debilitated state. I call that limping over the goal line. And our publication 800-160, that's the one on the graphic here, our systems security engineering publication, is really the pub that we've developed to help people deal with architecture and engineering issues, design issues. That can be for individual components, or it can be for the entire system. And now we're moving out into the supply chain, as we've seen with SolarWinds. So it's important that everybody be part of the solution, not just the people who are the customers, but the people who are in the development side as well.
And so that is all helpful information, but the fact remains that planning for a secure cloud infrastructure for an organization with any degree of complexity is a little bit of a daunting challenge, and recognize that in a presentation like this, it's hard to get from the big picture resources down to the specifics. So one of the things that we would like to do with the bulk of today's session is look at two different government organizations and how they're approaching cloud. And the first is the US Department of State. If we could go to the next slide, please. Brian Merrick is the Director of Cloud Programs for the State Department. And as you might imagine, that organization has a remarkably complex architecture. It needs to span the globe. It needs to connect highly secure information across IT infrastructure that is often widely varying in quality, and is often having to work through systems that may be controlled by actors who are not entirely trustworthy. So the security considerations for the State Department's cloud services and the simple connectivity challenges are fairly massive. So Mr. Merrick, in this clip we're going to go to, is going to talk in some detail about the way he's approached the architecture and how they're trying to build out that system. So if we could go to that video.
So first off, on the security and compliance piece, I think it's important to understand that, first off, the majority of mechanics in the cloud operate very differently than in on-prem environments. And it's definitely been an education and a journey as we've moved through these different pieces and parts and really worked through achieving our levels of maturity on this. So, obviously from a traditional on-prem type of environment, you're really managing everything, right? And as you go up the stack, if you will, into types of cloud systems and capabilities, you have to account for the differences and nuances in how they operate. So obviously, as you work your way up the stack into, pure SaaS, you have a lot less control. But you also get a lot more functionality at speed and at a much more simplified cost structure as well. So you really have to balance that and weigh it. Where we're seeing a lot of complexities is certainly in the hybrid environments, where we see a lot of data being held, storage pieces still on-prem, but then also working through a variety of different cloud architectures to deliver a specific business solution and outcome. So it's really important, sort of as Chris was saying earlier, the cloud security is as good as what you make it. And so you still have to do the hard work and the heavy lifting of ensuring that you've got your entire span of your environment covered with a good solid baseline. But you still have to think through and war game through what those threat actors may do to enter your environment and exfiltrate data. So this is just to give everyone sort of a level setting on sort of, how you may want to approach thinking about this. And so as we've done it, we basically use a shared responsibility model on our enterprise cloud platforms. So it's not so much a center of excellence, if you will, but we basically provide platform services to the rest of the department. And in doing that, we basically leave the management controls for the application layer themselves, a lot of the data controls, to the owning organization when we're in an infrastructure as a service type of environment. But as things move up the stack, things shift, and that has some upsides to it. So that's been something that's been really helpful in terms of getting our cloud adoption really going, because you can imagine with that disparate set of different business drivers and needs, it's very difficult to resource all of those capabilities across that large of a span of the organization.
So could obviously go much deeper there, but it's a good start on showing how to sort of how to structure the systems and how to think about the different tiers of data and the interrelations that need to be managed there. Something that Mr. Merrick touched on just very briefly was the identity side and the zero trust side. But with our next speaker, we're going to go into much more depth there. Cherian Savignanum is with the National Science Foundation. If we could jump to the next slide, please. And he's the chief enterprise architect. National Science Foundation is, is a research organization and really a grant-giving organization. It's focused on encouraging this research with all sorts of partners at institutions of higher education, independent research shops, and so it's hard to think of a more data-driven organization than the NSF. And like most organizations, the National Science Foundation has gone more fully remote over the last couple of years and has been increasingly leaning into using cloud services for those reasons we touched on earlier of scalability, security, being able to connect disparate data sets. And one of the key takeaways has been that trying to secure the data and the network, while those are important things, is never going to do it in a system this complicated. And so really focusing on the user and managing their identity, their credentials and access is key. And so let's go to this video clip and hear what Cherian has to say.
I want to go back and talk about the identity management function that works on top of this distributed cloud architecture. Let's again go from the bottom, the public facing portals. So how we have architected this, for a multi-factor authentication solution, and we use login.gov for this, and on top of that sits our role-based access control. So we clearly secure the communication all the way through, and then when it goes into the infrastructure accessing specific services, we also map this identity back to the cloud native technologies to get the end-to-end identity management function working, because this is very critical in this new world of cybersecurity and zero trust framework, where you want to make sure the person who's accessing a specific function, specific set of government information or data has the authority and access to the data to the endpoint on both sides. So this is why the end-to-end identity matters it's very critical. So if you look at from the staff who are working in the building, they are obviously using a high-speed private connection, and the authentication mechanism is PIV and role-based access control. And on the top, if you're a remote user, again, the same thing. If you're a remote user, it's like PIV and RBAC. So in the staff scenario, again, the goal is to map these identity back to our solutions hosted in the cloud, or even, it could be infrastructure as a service, it could be a SaaS, it could be a shared service. Actually, in case of the SaaS and PaaS and shared service, it's super straightforward, because we just take our account management function and map it to their accounts management function in Office 365 or Salesforce. So you get that end-to-end identity map, and you have complete transparency in who is having the right access to the data. But if it is an infrastructure as a service, we use the cloud native functions. We map this back to the Amazon's or Microsoft's identity management function in the cloud native solution world, and to get this kind of transparency. So this is kind of our identity management architecture that works. Again, it's like a 50,000 foot view. Okay, so anyway, so since the time is limited, I want to kind of speed up our discussion here. Like on the other side, you have SASE, which is another critical thing that is needed in this world of distributed cloud, where it is a policy agent. You can use that SASE to segment your policies and focus on dedicating network for remote imaging of your desktop. You could do a geofencing. You can also create policies such that people cannot access your services from certain locations. And this is the new toy in the cybersecurity world that plays very well with the SaaS and PaaS capabilities. Because remember, the SaaS and PaaS capabilities are tough to control in a network-centric cybersecurity world. You need to have this kind of a security broker solution in the cloud to manage your SaaS and PaaS platforms. Again, so coming to the infrastructure as a service, we practice DevSecOps. Again, we in the container technology, we embed the security solution as part of the microservice or the container, like Twistlock. So it constantly monitors our cybersecurity posture. And then we also use the cloud native functions for key management or encryption and all kind of things. We just leverage the cloud native function, and then on top of that, we do DevSecOps.
So hopefully those last two presentations have given a sense of how some federal agencies are tackling this and offering lessons that other government organizations can use. I just want to hit on a few final big picture points before we wrap today. And if we could go to the next slide, please. All of these organizations are, they're preparing for effective mission delivery, but they're guarding against the worst case scenarios and wanting to manage those risks. And in all of these in different ways, they're dealing with the contingency planning, trying to identify where the real threats are, to minimize the likelihood of them occurring, but making sure that that resiliency is built in, that it is about being able to recover, because preventing troublesome incidents is, no one's going to bat 1,000 on that. Those incidents, as we've touched on before, can be natural disasters or human hackers. And the good news is that a lot of the protections can guard against both. Obviously, defending against a ransomware attack is different than guarding against a power outage, but being prepared to recover from those incidents requires a lot of the same building blocks. And when it comes to securing that data, having an enterprise-wide data management system and a really robust backup approach, which having immutable backups, meaning that once created, they can't be altered, edited, it can only be appended to, is essential. And then having a system that identifies where those backups live, when they were last made, and tying that with being able to tell where compromise is likely to occur to improve time to recovery and be able to bring systems back as quickly as possible. And then it's a little bit of a platitude, but the pandemic has proven the value of the advanced planning. Steps that the NSF and the State Department were taking to move to the cloud before COVID hit have paid huge dividends as both workers and the citizens being served have had to engage remotely and being able to move to more location-agnostic systems. And if we could go to the next slide, please. Sort of three changes to make, and these are sort of distilling from all of our participants today. Automation, Mr. Ross talked about in particular, but making sure that the system is software defined is key. And being able to bring that that management layer that can look across the entire system, for whether it's for your secure backups, your incident response. You need to be able to approach that at an enterprise level and not be doing it on a application by application or system by system level. Secure cloud for design, it could be many presentations unto itself, but the points that Mr. Savignanem making in particular, I think go to that issue. And then ultimately a risk-based approach, understanding that the risks are at a certain level infinite, and that the risk can never be driven to zero, but organizations need to have an accurate understanding of what that risk really is, how much of that risk they're willing to accept, and how they're going to be prepared to recover from it. And so finally, if we could go to the next slide, I just want to steer people to a few of the resources that were touched on here. The Fedramp and StateRamp sites explain the programs themselves, also include catalogs of the cloud services that have been given those seals of approval. The NIST cybersecurity framework is a great starting point. There's also the risk management framework and any number of other resources that can be helpful to IT organizations in any sector. And I will call attention to GCN's own cloud coverage, which reports on some of the cases that were discussed here today, and looking at things at the federal, state, and local level week in and week out. There's lots of good case studies and additional information there. And with that, Terry, I want to hand back to you and thank you for the chance to present today.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Troy. That was insightful, and it is going to have to be it for today. I want to thank Rubrik also for sponsoring this webcast. And just a reminder, in the next day or so, we will be emailing you a link to an archived version of this session so you can review it or share it with a colleague. Thank you for attending today, and that concludes today's webcast. Thank you again.